So this is the framework that really is the underpinning methodology of this. So obviously at the start of this, it's very apparent that Hilton Head Island is a very fascinating and complex community. You have a remarkable history, all sorts of different layers in that. You have a really intriguing social fabric in terms of the way people are distributed and how people got here. And so we knew that the task to think deeply about a future would have to be very robust and would have to be really good methodology, right? So it was built on scenario planning, which was the work of the think tank. And basically that group looked at what were a range of plausible futures for the island, and plausible being the right word. So we're not talking fantasy, we're talking things that are within the scope of, you know, plausibility as in reality. And the engagement that ensued after that was really drilling into whereabouts in this sort of future canvas do we want to end up, right? And I know many of you have seen that sort of matrix, so I won't go through that, but roughly speaking, just if you aren't familiar with this, roughly speaking, the bottom left-hand corner sort of represents a future of not quite least change, but certainly a future that would play out if we didn't change very much, like a status quo type of future. The top right-hand corner sort of represents a future where there'd be more proactive change, like probably at the maximum at the top right, but they're gradients. Those big axes and scales there are intended to be continuums. Roughly speaking, as we go up the scale, we're looking at more redevelopment, more economic diversification in the economy over time. As we go across the diagram, we're talking about left to right, a more inclusive, multi-generational sort of community or multi-dimensional community on the right. So on the left, it's a focus on destination. On the right, it's a focus on the inclusive multi-dimensional. On the bottom, on the vertical axis, the bottom is protecting traditional strengths. At the top is like a revitalisation, modernisation. So that's all I'm going to say. And if you're not familiar with this, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to read the report, right? But this is a really foundational piece to the thinking and the dialogue that followed. So I want to turn, if I can, to the vision and strategic action plan report. Because again, I want to just go through the high-level components. So the whole point of this, right, is at the bottom of that diagram, which is a data-driven, consensus-based vision. Okay, so what was very clear was that we needed to have something that was robust. You know, a visioning process in a community is not just who shouts the loudest. You know, so we wanted to build a very strong data-based, data-driven process so that people could see the logic, you know, that gets built over time. And we were looking for a consensus, like a point of consensus in terms of what's the aspirational future that the people in this community share. And so that sort of inverted pyramid sort of reflects that we took the scenario planning think tank sort of output at the top and we kept working that down and sort of finessing that and trying to refine where's this data-driven consensus-based vision, what's that point in the future look like? So I want to, and if many of you would know this, but we were really using the sort of heat map principle. Just to refresh us all, because I think this is really important data for the next step. This is the outcomes at the level of what we call the expected future. So expected future is what would happen or where would we end up if we don't do anything different, okay? And so these concentrations of colour, the deeper the colour or the bigger the number, and they're exactly the same correlation, that shows the greater number of people on that point, right? So if you look at this one on the left-hand chart with the squares on it, that's the output from the think tank, and we didn't show anybody this until after the community had buy-in, right? We didn't want to bias it, but that's where they landed at the end of the think tank. And the chart on the right, which is on the data visualisation platform or portal, that's the results from the 700 community surveys. So what you can see, two things, right? One is a very high correlation between the think tank and the community engagement results. The chart on the right, those circles are a first level of averaging, so we just take a little bit of the noise out. So they're cohorts, which is gender, age and ethnicity kind of cohorts, right? But you can see that there's this repeated concentration and clustering. So somewhere in that safe harbour is what people saw, and pretty much we can get it down to a cell or two within that matrix of where people pretty much share the view of where this island would end up if you don't do anything different, right? And the implications of that are spelled out in the scenario planning report and in the vision survey. Probably more interesting is what's the preferred future, right? So that was and this is the basis of the vision. So obviously when you find a point of consensus around a preferred future, that's your vision, right? That becomes your vision point. On the chart on the left is with the square boxes, that's what the think tank group landed on. And the chart on the right is the 700 community surveys, right? So two things to note, or three things actually to note. One is almost all the responses are within the scenario space called reinventing sustainability again. Okay, and you can actually go on the portal and filter out that by different cohorts, and we'll talk a little about that, right? So that gives us the scenario space. The other thing to note is that the two groups are quite close in correlation. A little bit of sort of a toning back from aspiration from the community engagements versus the think tank. That's actually not surprising because the think tank participants invented the scenarios and they spent a whole day on it, and so they're going to be a little bit more vested and naturally more kind of gung-ho about it than people who may have a shorter exposure to it. The third thing to really note is there's a gap between the preferred and expected, which we'll talk about. So one thing is we know, and what's important about the gap is how big it is and in what direction is it moving. Okay, so that tells us a lot about what we need to think about as we talk about an action plan, which is what I'll get to. But there's one thing to talk about a vision where I just get the pick, right? You know, here's the canvas and I'm just going to pick here, right? And obviously that produces a sort of an aspirational result. In a community like this, it's really important to think about and understand, or try and understand, is behaviour going to match that aspiration? So it's one thing to say, for example, we don't want X to happen, or we do want X to happen, but when push comes to shove, are people going to make that? Are they going to make the investments or the decisions? And, you know, you can just look at some of the public debates that are happening right now, right, between what people want and what people are willing to do, right? So, and if there's a big cognitive dissonance in that, then you have an issue, which means you're not going to move forward probably, right, or you're going to have frustration. So what this chart's looking at is we asked people a series of 8 questions, which were 4 questions on each of those axes, so the X and the Y, and they were subset questions, and people were presented with a response scale or a sensitivity scale that reflected the axis and the extremes on the end, or the endpoints. And so, and we weren't telling people we were doing this. So this is a way for us to kind of validate, are people going to make decisions that are consistent with, in a cumulative sense, consistent with their aspiration? And that's all the data. So we haven't done a first level of averaging. That's just all the data. The bigger the dots just means there's more people on that spot. And what we did was we took those 8 responses and recombined them to create an XY point, right? So the 4 questions that were associated with the horizontal axis, we recombined their responses, created an average which became the X and then the Y. And so a couple of things to note, right? Well, one is we have a spread, right? Well, we know that, right? There's, you know, people at far left corner, people at the far top right corner. Not unusual. And it's not unusual to see that sort of line running through that sort of horizontal axis, because typically people who have an appetite for change will have an appetite for change on multiple dimensions. Okay, just typically, right? So that's what drives that sort of line. But if you look, you have somebody down in the bottom right. Okay, see that dot down there? So that's somebody who has a lot of appetite for change on the horizontal axis, but no appetite for change on the vertical axis. So you can sort of tease that out, right? There's also a very strong concentration around what also reflects the preferred future, right? So clearly there's noise, right? And we want to understand that. But if you look at where the average is or the consensus point, it very much mirrors the preferred future in the previous approach. But not everybody's the same, right? So you can play with this. This will be fascinating for you. You can go onto the data visualization portal and you can look at people's responses on that type of chart by all sorts of categories. So You can filter it out by age, ethnicity, where people live, gender, how long they've been associated with the island, and they're cumulative filters. So you can kind of build up, you know, ever sort of focused criteria if you want to look at it. We'll run out of data quicker than you'll run out of fun, right? You know, because even though there's 700 there, you know, you can start to filter this down and you'll lose people pretty fast. But the two big cohorts to play with and think about, both at the level of this visualisation, which is the recombined data, but at the individual question level, because that's also on the platform. The two big cohorts are around age. So people who are, and I don't know if we call them younger, but people who are 10 to 50 have a very similar view, okay, in terms of appetite for change and response around issues. That's distinctly different from 60 to the end of the scale, right? And the 50 to 60s are sort of somewhere in between, but there's two big cohorts, and you'll see it repeatedly through the data in terms of appetite for change or reaction to issues. The other big splitter is there's clearly a different view, and I'll show you some of this data, of people who live in gated communities and people who live outside the gated communities. That's a very distinct, and it's more intense in some of the questions than others. Not surprising, right? But I think it's really important as we think about strategic action plan that we understand that, right? Because that's the dynamic that's under the surface. So these two charts are two that I just picked out. And the one on the left, where you can see that the concentration is more predominantly down in the safe harbour quadrant on the lower left, that's people who live in Port Royal Plantation. Okay, so I just pulled them out. So that's everybody who lives in Port Royal. There's no age filtering or anything on that, right? But you'll see it in some of the other cohorts as well. The chart on the right is all the people who are 10 to 50. 10 to 50 years of age, right? So that's what I mean about the younger cohort. They have obviously a concentration or an appetite to that upper right quadrant, and you know, remembering that the kind of continuum of change sort of goes bottom left to top right. Again, probably not super surprising, but it's really good, I think, to be able to quantify this and understand it in terms of decision making going forward. Because clearly there are going to be pockets in this community where people are going to have more or less compelling need or appetite for change, and I think understanding that's important. You can also look at this in terms of ethnic breakdown, or you know, how long people have been associated with the island and so on, right? But that's just some high-level comments there. And how this plays out at the individual sort of issue level. So I picked one of the 8 sliding questions, and this one was around residential fabric. So this is all the data. You'll see on that side there, on the right-hand side, you'll see all the filter charts there. There's age group, gender, ethnicity, self-description. That's what people are most interested in, where they currently live, gated, not gated, years living on Hilton Head Island. They're your filters, right, to play with. So this is all the data, and the question is about residential fabric. And the scale was, you know, when we look to the future, what would you like it to be like? 1, which is on the left-hand side, is strongly retain the exclusive and select residential focus, okay? And 10, which is on the right-hand side, is a more diverse residential and neighbourhood options. Okay, so 1 to 10, right? So that's the scale. That's all the data. But if we break this out, and you can play with the filters yourself, but this is the gated community response, right? So you can see that that's very strongly skewed towards strongly retain the exclusive and select residential focus. If you go to the other side, which is the not gated community, then you have a very different distribution. Okay, and I think understanding this and being able to quantify it, it's a really key issue for this community to be able to wrestle with, because I imagine that data would tell me that you could probably have a lot of polarised views around topics, you know, and so that's the laughter recognition. So, and if you're having polarised views, sometimes that can bog down progress because we're not able to find consensus or find the way to move forward. And not every decision has to affect every component of the island. I mean, one of the things that is unique is you have different layers of governance here. I mean, you have housing associations that have very clear governance and control over what happens within their territory or jurisdiction, and then you have, you know, a town who has a broader kind of view of the island and so on. But understanding these nuances is going to be really important, right? So, if you look at that, I mean, that's, you know, so if you look at the average data, you go, well, you know, we're not really sure, but then here you have a whole different level of clarity, and that is just the filter that looks at gated, not gated, okay? So that's all there on the portal, and it's in the community engagement report.